My name is Richard Galvin, and I am the Betty S. Wright Chair in Applied Ethics, which is in the Philosophy Department, and I've been at TCU since 1982. My plan tonight is to talk to you about a very general idea, the idea being that we can use standards of rational evaluation to evaluate moral judgments, and I plan to demonstrate how to do that by looking at a contemporary moral issue and to see how a person has actually done that, and to illustrate how it is that this person's work has arguably led to a change in the policy regarding euthanasia on the part of the American Medical Association. The background for my talk is the following. In 1973, the American Medical Association adopted a policy affirming that while it is sometimes permissible for a physician to withhold treatment from a patient and allow that patient to die, it is never permissible for a physician to take direct action to kill a patient. An argument was offered by a philosopher named James Rachels a few years after the policy was approved, in which he argued that the AMA policy claims that whereas passive euthanasia is sometimes permissible, active euthanasia is never so. But Rachels claims that this position is incoherent, that hastening the death of a patient by active means can be morally equivalent to, and perhaps even morally preferable to, doing so by passive means. His argument illustrates how reasoned moral argument is possible, and that ethics need not be seen as simply an expression of one's feelings or the application of some set of dogma, whether religious or other. The impact of Rachel's argument is a series of reevaluations of the AMA position, both within and outside the medical profession, that the public debate on the question of euthanasia has also changed, I would argue, due to Rachel's, and that numerous states, Oregon, Washington, and Montana, to name three, as well as other countries, the Netherlands for one, have essentially adopted the position that Rachel's argued for in this piece that I'm going to talk about. I'd like to begin by making some preliminary distinctions. The term euthanasia in Greek literally means happy death, and it refers to the practice of ending, or at least not prolonging, the life of a patient when continued existence would be worse for that patient than ending that patient's life. Now, I'd like also to introduce two subsets of the distinction, I would like to introduce two distinctions within the category of euthanasia, one having to do with the voluntariness of the patient who's quote-unquote participating in the euthanasia, and the other having to do with the means by which the euthanasia is brought about. We can distinguish between voluntary euthanasia, non-voluntary euthanasia, and involuntary euthanasia as follows. In a case of voluntary euthanasia, the patient freely and knowingly consents to the procedure. Now, we have to admit that whether a patient does so knowingly, whether a patient does so freely, are contentious questions, and certainly lots can be said about them, but the basic distinction still would have it be the case that if the patient freely and knowingly consents, then the euthanasia is voluntary. On the other hand, there is non-voluntary euthanasia, cases in which the patient does not give free, informed consent in the requisite sense. We can think of lots of cases of this sort. For example, if a patient winds up unconscious in an emergency room and it is determined that the patient would be better off either by not having a procedure actually begun on the patient or having a procedure that had already begun stopped on the patient, but the patient is unconscious, the patient cannot consent. Now, non-voluntary euthanasia should be contrasted with involuntary euthanasia, in which the patient actually dissents, but the euthanasia occurs anyway. You can imagine a case of don't kill me, but we do anyway. It probably doesn't happen very often, but those are three distinct cases. Now, those cases can be distinguished again from cases of active versus passive euthanasia. In cases of active euthanasia, direct action is taken to kill the patient. Examples of these might be a lethal injection, or say the administering of some sort of oral medication that stops the heart. Passive euthanasia, on the other hand, involves either failing to administer or withdrawing some sort of treatment that would prolong the life of the patient. Now, with those distinctions in hand, I suggest we turn to the original 1973 AMA policy statement, which runs as follows. It says that the intentional termination of life by another human being, mercy killing, is contrary to that for which the medical profession stands, but that the cessation of the employment of extraordinary means to prolong the life of the body where there is irrefutable evidence that biological death is imminent can be engaged in. This is the decision of the patient and the immediate family, and the advice and judgment of the physician should be available in making this decision. That was the AMA policy statement from 1973, and in 1975, a philosopher of all people, James Rachels, published a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine in which he argued that that policy amounts to the claim that whereas passive euthanasia is sometimes morally permissible, active euthanasia is always morally wrong. He then argues that the AMA policy is inconsistent, and he gives two main arguments. The first argument runs like this. What justifies the implementation of passive euthanasia, withdrawing or refusing to engage in treatment, is some sort of humanitarian impulse. What he means by that is that in certain cases, the justification not to administer or to withdraw the treatment is made because it is deemed that to do so would be inhumane, when a patient would simply have a case of prolonged suffering if we were to do so. He gives a few examples, and I'll just mention one. He imagines a person who suffers from terminal throat cancer. And suppose that the cancer is growing in such a way that a surgical procedure can be performed, which would give the patient, say, 3 weeks to live. Whereas if the surgical procedure were not to be performed, the patient would die in 2 weeks. In each case, it's going to be a miserable existence for the patient. There may even be some sort of loss of consciousness at the end, but certainly there would be no happiness and no dignity. And Rachel says, look, all the time, physicians make decisions not to administer things like that sort of surgery because they believe that to do so would simply be to prolong the suffering of the patient. So, here's the deal. He says, think about what the humanitarian impulse actually tells you in that case. Doesn't, he asks, the humanitarian impulse actually favor actively killing the patient? After all, if the reason why we refuse to do the throat surgery is that to do so would simply result in the patient having a week's additional suffering, you might ask, if we had the patients say freely informed consent, why not end it now? Why not eliminate 3 weeks of suffering rather than just 1 week of suffering? It would appear that if the humanitarian impulse justifies lessening the patient's suffering by 1 week, that same humanitarian impulse, if all other things are equal, should actually compel us to end 3 weeks worth of suffering for that patient. So, Rachel's argument is, in some cases, the humanitarian impulse, which is what justifies either withdrawing or not administering the treatment to a patient because there would be no benefit, actually favors not just passively allowing people to die, but rather, and again, if we build in the background factors with consent and knowledgeability and stuff, it might actually favor doing so actively. Now, we move on to argument number 2, which is the argument that has received the most press. I think that's because everybody pretty much thinks that argument number 1 works. Now, Rachel says the AMA might be able to defend their policy in the following way. While we agree that it's true that the humanitarian impulse does favor actively ending patients' lives in some cases as opposed to passively letting them die, there is a gigantic distinction, a morally significant distinction, between killing patients, actively killing them, and passively allowing them to die. In other words, if it really is true, as some might say, that killing a patient is so morally worse than allowing a patient to die, then even though the humanitarian impulse seems to favor active euthanasia in these kinds of cases, the difference between killing and letting die is so morally significant that it overwhelms and indeed, you might say, obliterates any distinction between the two cases that's made simply on the basis of humanitarian grounds. So, the argument would go, even though humanitarianism might favor active over passive, the fact that active means of killing are so much morally worse than passive means of letting die, it doesn't amount to a moral difference in the final analysis. We still ought not to kill patients because of it. Rachels argues against this, and his argument, as I said, has received a lot of press, so much press that it has a name. It's called the bare difference argument. We'll look at the structure of it briefly, and then I'll give you a version of the bare difference argument that I will take some liberties with, given the context of this talk tonight. The structure of Rachel's argument is as follows. Produce a case in which there are two different ways of going about doing things. All the morally relevant factors are identical in each case. But in one case, a person actively kills another, whereas in the other case, the person merely passively lets the person die. But here's the secret of Rachel's case. The secret is that it looks like there isn't any morally significant difference between the active killing and the passive letting die, and here's how the case goes. Suppose we have a young professor early on in his career. Call him Professor Vic. And Professor Vic is strapped for funds, probably has a big family to feed, didn't get a big raise last year, and Vic's a very popular teacher, has one of his students come in, and the student wants to show her appreciation for just how good of a teacher Vic is, and so she says, I know what I'll do. I have all of this money, I'm going to leave it to you as part of my inheritance. And of course, Professor Vic is very happy about this, but he also starts thinking about it and says, now wait a minute, my student's 18 years old, I'm in my, late 30s, when am I ever going to get to see this? And the kids need new shoes now. And so what Professor Vic decides to do is to speed things up a little bit and get some of his hands on the money. And so he finds out where the student lives, goes over one night when he knows nobody else is going to be around. Suppose he's got all of his informants in place. He knows that this is the time when the student is going to take a shower, say have to go into the gym or something like that. Breaks into the place where she's living, goes into the bathroom while the kid's there, throws open the curtain, hits the student over the head with a baseball bat. Down the student goes, face down, she expires. Now consider case number 2 with, say, Professor Noel. Professor Noel is similarly financially strapped. The whole scenario is exactly the same. The student comes in, money's in the will, Noel panics, decides he's got to have the money now, goes over to the student's house, goes into the bathroom, and just as Professor Noel is about to take the curtain and pull it back, the student slips on the soap and hits her head on the faucet, falls face down in the tub. Her hair goes into the drain, and the tub starts to fill up with water. Now, Professor Noel has also read the AMA's piece and says, oh, this is great for me. I don't have to actively kill this girl. I can simply passively watch this girl die. And maybe he goes over and makes sure that her head doesn't come up, but he doesn't have to touch her because she expires. So, The difference between the two cases is what? The intentions are the same. They each want to get the money. The result is the same. The student dies. The means in one case is different from the other. In Professor Vick's case, he actively kills the student, whereas in Professor Knoll's case, he merely passively watches the student die. But Rachel's argues that most of us would think that Professor Knoll was no less morally blameworthy for passively observing the student dying than Professor Vick was in actively killing the student. But of course, Rachel says, if there was this huge, gigantic, morally significant difference between killing and letting die, we would expect it to show up in some way in a case in which all of the other factors are exactly the same, except that in one case we have a killing and in the other case we have a letting die. And indeed, Rachel says, in active euthanasia, we relieve suffering. Passive euthanasia, we relieve suffering. We have a patient who dies in one case, a patient who dies in the other case. The only difference between the two is that in one case we actively kill, and in the other case we passively let die. And this leads Rachel's to his conclusion, which has come to be known as the equivalency thesis. And that is that active euthanasia is permissible if passive euthanasia is, and if passive euthanasia is permissible, then active euthanasia must be permissible as well. And so that's the application of logical reasoning to a moral problem that has led people to reevaluate their position on euthanasia. Thank you.